The year is 1453, and the Byzantine Empire, the very last figment of Rome's long-faded glory, is itself in its death throes. Having continued the legacy of Roman rule for almost 1,500 years, the Byzantine Empire was once a superpower, but centuries of constant warfare and a schism between East and West in the Christian Church have bled the empire dry. Constantinople itself, the seat of the Byzantine Empire, one of the jewels of the ancient world, and the last gasp of the Roman Empire, is now threatened by a massive Ottoman army led by Sultan Mehmed II, who is hell-bent on making the legendary capital his new seat of power. The first Christian capital, Constantinople, had been the seat of imperial power since 330 AD, when the first Christian Roman emperor Constantine the Great declared it his capital. As the shining jewel of European civilization, Constantinople was no stranger to warfare, and the city had been besieged many times, falling only once before 1204 during the Fourth Crusade. After each siege, though, the city added to its impressive array of fortifications and was widely considered throughout the world as all but unassailable. With 12 miles of walls that surrounded the city and 60-foot moats, the city was easily held by a small number of defenders against a much larger force. On the Bosphorus Strait, the seawalls prevented a naval assault of the city, and a heavy chain stretched across the Golden Horn blocked any ship from entering the city. Yet by 1450, the city had shrunk drastically in size due to the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, and by the time of the Ottoman siege, it consisted mostly of a series of walled villages separated by fields that were often planted. The once booming metropolis and center of imperial and Christian power was in essence a ghost town, and only had about 50,000 inhabitants at the time of its final siege, considerably less than the 800,000 people who lived there at its peak. Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI had understood that the new Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Mehmed II, wanted his city for himself. At first, he tried to placate the Sultan by sending gifts, but these were returned and the diplomats sent to Mehmed's court were executed. Realizing that war was inevitable, Constantine XI turned to the Christian powers of Western Europe, but a deep schism between Eastern and Western Christianity had split the church in two. Constantine offered Pope Nicholas V to reunite the two churches, but he had severely overestimated the influence that the Pope had on the Western powers. Britain, France, and Spain had become wary of the growing power of the papacy, and for their part, Britain and France were exhausted after the 100 Years' War. Ultimately, all that the West would be able to contribute to the defense of Constantinople would be a few hundred volunteers, along with about 24 ships and some supplies. In total, the Byzantines were able to marshal a force of only 7,000 men to defend the city against an estimated 50,000 to 80,000 Ottomans. While the numbers were widely one-sided, Constantinople was so well fortified that there was every reason to believe that the city could hold out until either help from the West arrived or the Sultan expended too many of his troops and supplies to make the conquest worth the effort. With its incredible system of walls, towers, and fortifications, the tiny force of 7,000 could have easily held against overwhelming numbers, were it not for the brilliant mind of one Hungarian engineer, a mysterious figure known only by the name of Orban. This master craftsman initially offered his services to the Byzantines, but they had been unable to meet his fees. Taking his services to Sultan Mehmed II instead, he promised that his weapons would blast the walls of Babylon itself. Mehmed decided to gamble on the confident engineer, and he would not be disappointed, as Orban immediately began construction of a cannon, which would take a whopping 3 months to build. The cannon would be 27 feet long and could blast a 600-pound stone projectile well over a mile. This far exceeded the capacity of other Ottoman cannons, which, while formidable, could only blast projectiles weighing between 100 and 200 pounds. But this super cannon had some serious drawbacks, as it took 3 hours to reload, and its cannonballs were in short supply. Nonetheless, knowing that he faced the greatest fortifications in the world, Mehmed had a foundry established 150 miles away to build and supply the massive artillery pieces, which were so big that each one had to be dragged by 60 oxen all the way to Constantinople. Mehmed was determined to take the city though, and ultimately had 70 of these large bombards built, with more built while the siege was happening. Facing the impressive fortifications, Mehmed decided that his attack would be on the Theodosian walls, a series of heavy walls and ditches which protected Constantinople from the west, and was the only part of the city not surrounded by water. On the 2nd of April 1453, his army made camp in front of the mighty walls and officially began the 3-month siege. the defenders enjoyed the benefit of walls that had recently been repaired after a long state of disrepair and were equipped with various medium cannons. However, the recoil of their own cannons could cause damage to the walls, and thus were only sparingly used. The attack would be mostly repelled with bow and crossbow, as well as some rudimentary firearms that had been brought in from the west. A fleet of 26 ships defended the city from naval assault, and though Mehmed's own forces numbered at 126 ships, a giant sea chain prevented access to the harbor, and venturing too near the walls could be disastrous for the attackers. On the 5th of April, the Sultan himself arrived at his war camp and stood with his army opposite Constantine XI and his defenders, the last Byzantine emperor standing on his walls alongside his men. As the siege began, Mehmed sent teams of elite troops to assault the remaining smaller Byzantine strongholds outside of the city. Within a few days, these forts were taken, and Mehmed's rear was secure against an unexpected counterattack from outside the city. The massive cannons began their terrible bombardment, hurling giant stone balls at the mighty walls. However, the 3-hour reload process, poor accuracy, and small numbers allowed the city defenders to repair damage to their walls caused by the artillery. For weeks, the mighty guns would relentlessly fire, and the titanic stones they hurled would slowly erode even Constantinople's mighty walls. At sea, the Ottoman fleet encountered the giant chain that had been stretched across the entrance to the Golden Horn and barred approach to the city. Unable to destroy the mighty chain, the ships were largely excluded from the siege, and instead would serve as guards to ensure that no Christian ships exited or entered the city. Against all odds, though, on the 20th of April, a small flotilla of 4 Christian ships broke through the huge Ottoman army after heavy fighting, deeply embarrassing the Ottomans and boosting the morale of the defenders. Commander of the Ottoman fleet, Suleiman Baltoglu, was spared his life for his humiliating failure, only after his subordinates testified to his extreme bravery during the fighting. With supplies slipping into the city and the Ottomans unable to break past the mighty harbor chain, Sultan Mehmed decided that if his ships couldn't sail past the chain and into the Golden Horn, then they would simply go around the chain. He set thousands of his soldiers to cutting down every available tree in the area and greased hundreds of logs, which he had laid side by side. This created a road of greased logs, and he then commanded his men to manually pull each and every one of his ships up a hill and down the other side to settle them back in the water, effectively bypassing the mighty chain. In a desperate attempt to destroy the massing ships, the defenders sent out a wave of fire ships to attack the Ottoman ships, supporting few weapons but loaded with barrels of oil. Fire ships were meant to be piloted into the midst of an enemy fleet and then set on fire, which would in turn set the rest of the enemy fleet on fire. Yet the Turks had advanced warning of the attack and were prepared for the fire ships, forcing the Christians to retreat with heavy losses. Swimming to shore and fleeing their sinking ships, 40 Italian sailors were captured by Ottoman forces, and Sultan Mehmed ordered that they be impaled in full view of the city's defenders. In retaliation, the Byzantines gathered 260 Ottoman prisoners and executed them upon their walls one by one. The bypassing of the chain upon the mouth of the Golden Horn meant that the defenders now had to reposition a large number of their forces to defend the sea walls, lowering the strength on the western walls, which faced repeated heavy attacks. After several unsuccessful frontal attacks which left thousands of Ottoman dead, the Sultan ordered the construction of underground tunnels to be dug below the walls and filled with barrels of gunpowder. The ensuing explosion would devastate the walls above and leave the city open for invasion. However, a German engineer, Johannes Grant, who had volunteered to defend Constantinople, had envisioned this turn of events and was quick to have counter-tunnels dug, which let the Byzantines flood the Ottoman tunnels with Greek fire. On the 23rd of May, 2 Turkish officers were captured and tortured until they revealed the location of all the Turkish tunnels, which were quickly destroyed. About this time, opposition to Mehmed's siege had begun rising amongst his war council. Casualties were mounting, and despite the stunning bypassing of the sea chain, the city was still not any closer to falling. The dragging siege was also putting the Turkish forces in a precarious position, as it was feared that any day now reinforcements from Western Europe would arrive and trap the Turks between themselves and the city walls. Yet Mehmed was determined to take the city, and thus he mobilized his remaining troops for one last massive attack. Shortly after midnight on May 29th, the attack began. The walls in the northwest portion of the city had suffered heavy damage from the giant cannons, as they had been built earlier than the rest of the walls and were thus much weaker. A force of Turks managed to breach this section of the walls, only to be pushed back out by a brutal counterattack by the city's defenders. At this time, though, the Genoese general in charge of Constantine's defenders was seriously wounded and had to be evacuated from the ramparts, causing panic amongst the Genoese troops. Those troops retreated from their positions along the walls and toward the harbor, and in that retreat, Constantinople's fate was sealed. Constantine XI is said to have died leading his troops against the Turkish defenders, while other sources say that he had hung himself when he saw that defeat was inevitable. Constantinople's fate, however, is well documented, as the Sultan rewarded his victorious troops with 3 days of unlimited looting and violence. Thousands of women were raped and everything of value was stripped from the city. Turkish troops murdered anyone they pleased, and after the 3 days, the Sultan ordered an end to the violent free-for-all. The surviving population of Constantinople was shipped off as slaves, and it's said that when the Sultan overlooked the massive destruction his men had caused on the legendary city after 3 days, he was moved to tears, commenting, "What a great city we've given over to plunder and destruction."